Hey all, Jason Levon, priest at St. Luke's Episcopal Church in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Welcome to another edition of Pause and Pray. Last night, right before I went to bed, I received a heartbreaking text from a friend and colleague who informed me that another beloved friend and mentor and colleague, Father Stephen Pei, died yesterday. I was heartbroken on many levels. First, recognizing the loss the church experienced yesterday in Father Steve's death. Not only was he a gifted intellectual, but he was a profoundly compassionate pastor with a huge heart. I'm devastated because I lost not just a friend and mentor, but a beloved source of sacred steadiness in my shaky life. Steve was always an instrument of God's sacred steadiness reaching into my shaky life. And when I met him, it was shaky in a way, mostly a good way, but I was newly married, working in the real world. I had found this beautiful home in the Episcopal Church after having left priesthood in the Roman Catholic Church, and I was sensing this stir and call to step back into priestly ministry. But there's this complex process I needed to follow in the Episcopal Church, and I had no idea how to navigate it or where it would lead me. I'm fortunate to have some tremendous mentors, priests here in the Diocese of Milwaukee who helped me navigate that and who were sources of sacred steadiness in my shaky journey. I think of priests like Martha and Scott and our bishop, but also Father Steve Pei. He, at the time, was on the faculty at Nashotah House Seminary. We shared similar stories in that we were both former Roman Catholic priests. He was a Benedictine monk for many years. And I met him to talk about the process of going through an Anglican studies program in an Episcopal seminary. I could have been sent anywhere in the country, but after hearing my story, Steve sort of took me and Christy under his wings because he came to realize that Christy was gainfully employed here in Milwaukee with a steady and stable job, and instead of uprooting me, he worked closely with our bishop to ensure that I could do my Anglican studies right here in the Milwaukee area at Nashotah House, where I was blessed to have him as a professor as well. But it wasn't just the professional way in which Steve was an instrument of God's sacred steadiness reaching into my shaky life. There were plenty of personal ways he was that gift to me as well. I cherished our time over coffee or tea or a pint of beer, where we could share stories of our lives with each other in beautiful and holy ways to help navigate life. And even though Steve could run intellectual circles around me and many others because he was so beautifully brilliant, he never shied away from referring to lines from Monty Python movies or skits, or sharing laughter with me over some hilarious scenes from some of our favorite old British sitcoms like Keeping Up Appearances and Fawlty Towers and The Vicar of Dibley. Maybe it was his Benedictine upbringing, a spirituality that really values holy and sacred stability. But Steve was always this profound instrument in my life of God's sacred steadiness reaching into my shaky life. And I know I'm not alone in that experience of Steve. Many others are as well. Maybe it was a divine planning that in today's daily office we're invited to reflect on Psalms 26 and 28, which both celebrate God's ability to extend arms of steadiness into our shaky lives. Both Psalms using language that echoes throughout Scripture, language referring to God as a rock, and the way in which we find ourselves able to stand on level ground when everything else seems to be falling apart around us. Which, for me, if I'm honest, happens more often than I'd care to admit. But then again, that only gives me an invitation more and more to pause and to pray, and to reflect on all the ways in which we've come to experience that great gift of God extending arms of sacred steadiness into our shaky lives. To reflect on how we've experienced that love embodied in the gift of others, those Father Steves in our lives, and I invite you to name them for yourselves. And then to pray for the grace, to become instruments like Father Steve and those people we name, because we know the sacred call to become instruments of that same sacred, steady love for others, because our lives aren't the only ones that become shaky from time to time. God's peace and blessings to you all. Oh, and Steve, my dear brother, rest in peace and rise in glory.